Einhard's Life of Charlemagne by D.W. Draffin. Foreword by Walafridus Strabo, a Frankish abbot, circa 842 to 849. Charles, that most glorious emperor, is in these pages described by his longtime confidant and counselor, the great scholar Einhard. During his reign, there was not an official in the entire palace who won more praise for his learning and overall virtuous character than Einhard. And as a close adviser, he was present at many of the events he describes here, which gives this account the advantage of perfect accuracy. Einhard was born in Montgevet, a district of eastern Frankland. He was sent to school at St. Boniface the Martyr in the monastery of Fulda. He had no advantage of birth, but rather a keen intellect and remarkable talents, so Einhard was identified at a young age by Baugolf, the abbot of the monastery, as worthy of service in the palace of Charles. The emperor sought wise men more than any other king in the world, and when he found them, he showered them with love and a lively court in which they could fully develop their philosophies. It was in this way that Charles transformed what had been the dark and nearly blind kingdom he had inherited into a shining beacon of knowledge and learning, which we, barbarians until now, had never known. But that day is long past. Alas, it is happening again, that men's attentions are straying from learning and reason, and the light of wisdom is growing dim in them, and in many men entirely dying out. But little Einhard, for he was famously short, was such a paragon of education that once he arrived at court, there was hardly ever anyone whose company Charles would prefer. He would constantly ask for the scholar and share with him the emperor's deepest secrets and most private thoughts. Throughout his decades at the court, Einhard earned this trust again and again by responding with direct truth and sage advice, even more so after Charles died and his son Louis took the throne. That was a much more troubling time. Entire regions of the empire were falling into ruin by then, but with God's grace and a remarkably steady hand, Einhard guided the young emperor through each challenge, even as the little man was attacked and mocked for his cleverness. But he did not falter, and he eventually delivered the empire safely to their descendants. I, Walafridus Strabo, who personally knew the great man Einhard, provide this foreword so that all may know these words are true, and not only true, but a fascinating and brilliant account of the glory of Charles, without any fault or blemish. This edition contains notes and marginalia I have included to aid the organization of the text. Einhard's Preface. How to write an account on the life of King Charles. Once I had decided to do so, to recount his singular manner and our long conversations, to describe his glorious actions across the world, I realized that I could only successfully tell this story if I sheared it of all extra matter and only spoke of the heart of it. But what precisely to include? Evidence is important to me, so I will only add what can be proven by my own memory or a written account. I am also aware of the current fashion of the court, which would have me be brief and avoid going on in wearying detail about each historical event, so I will write in the direct way my readers expect. And lastly, I pray I do not offend those who have the habit, which appears to be growing more popular with each passing day, of feeling superior to the glories of yesterday, as shared by learned and eloquent scholars. Many men today believe that the details of life in the present day are more valuable than the memories of those of us who are growing old. And there is a feeling that if a thing isn't written down, that it will vanish into nothing forever, as if it never occurred. So those who follow the famous and powerful of today are now writing of their modern heroes so that they may be remembered forever. But even as out of fashion as this work might be, I have decided that I should write it anyway. For I was there, and I have the capacity to record the events, and I have seen no others take up the project. So here I sit, putting it all down for posterity, praying that the shadow of time might never obscure this king, the greatest and noblest of all men, and his famous deeds, which will scarcely be matched until the end of mankind. And another reason, perhaps foolish, to write of Charles. I owe it to him. He cared for me more than anyone ever has, from the first moment he invited me to court to his dying days. He and his children offered me a friendship which remained constant throughout their entire lives. He gave me so much, and for so long, and bound me so closely to himself, that I would be a mean-spirited ingrate to live and die without someday paying him tribute. I cannot allow the soaring legend of Charles to lapse into silence. And yet, the chronicle of such a king is so grand that the fact it is left to my paltry and insignificant gifts is a tremendous shame. I have no words to describe my life with the emperor. He needs more than my ill-formed words. He needs the eloquence of a Cicero. So, here is his book, The Life and Times of that great, glorious King Charles. I apologize again for my barbaric attempts at Latin in describing him. I only hope that I speak it well enough to do him justice, and that I haven't become so full of myself that I believe I can actually achieve what Cicero meant when he wrote of Latin writers in the first book of the Tusculans. If a man commits his thoughts to paper, when he can neither write them well nor arrange them sensibly, nor provide any pleasure to the reader, he is wasting both his precious leisure and his paper. That great orator may not look upon this shabby account with favor, but I had to risk the condemnation of his ghost. I do not care for the legacy of my own reputation. I only care to share the memory of King Charles. The Life of Charles. To begin with the historical foundations of the Frankish Empire, it was long ruled by the line of Merovings. This ended with the reign of King Hilderic, who was deposed by the Roman pontiff Stephen and sent tonsured into a monastery. But this was only a sad end to a sad line of kings. For generations, their kingships had been empty titles, and their reigns had been little more than a show, providing an empty mouthpiece for the real rulers behind the throne. The actual wealth and power was held by the prefects of the court, known as the mayors of the palace, and their rule was absolute. The impotent kings were content with their meaningless titles. They would sit on their gilded thrones with their long, flowing hair and beards, and act as if they truly ruled. They would nod sagely at ambassadors from every corner of the world, and in the end pretend that the speech they had been ordered to give came from their own minds. And that is all the king would ever do. The mayors allowed him a small estate and a paltry income, hardly enough to hire servants to run his household, keep him presentable, and show him the slightest bit of deference. Where kings of other nations might travel in gilded chariots, he was given a farmer's wagon, drawn by a pair of oxen and driven by a cowherd. Once a year, the mayors of the palace would trot him out, and he would listen to the petitioners in court. Then they would trot him right back home so that the prefects could make the actual decisions as to what must be done domestically and abroad. When Pope Stephen deposed Hilderic, the leader of these mayors was Pippin, the father of King Charles. He had inherited this office from his own grandfather and then father Charles Martel, the Hammer, the great general who smashed the upstart Frankish nobles trying to break the kingdom apart and famously stopped the advance of the Saracens who had invaded Gaul, first in Aquitania near Poitiers and then again near Narbonne on the river Bira, and forced them to retreat back into Spain. As a living legend, Charles Martel became the most powerful man in the kingdom, and his son Pippin was hardly less esteemed, for the court would allow none but the most powerful and wealthy men to rule them. Pippin shared this mayoral office with his brother Charlemagne, and for a number of years they worked together in perfect harmony, both effectively ruling the kingdom together while King Hilderic was rolled up to the gates every year on display. It is not known why Charlemagne decided to withdraw from the public. By his actions he showed that he was drawn to the mysteries of the contemplative life, so he retired to Rome in search of a more meaningful existence. Donning a cassock, he joined the monastery upon Mount Soracte, built near the church of the Blessed Sylvester, and for many years he enjoyed the peace he found there with the brothers. But every time a pilgrimage of Franks arrived to Rome, they insisted on visiting him and disrupting his tranquility. Finally, Charlemagne retreated from Mount Soracte further to the isolation of the monastery of St. Benedict in the settlement of Mount Cassino in the distant province of Samnium. There he practiced the daily observations of his religion until he concluded his earthly existence. After being elevated to the throne of the Frankish kingdom by Pope Zachary, Pippin ruled for another 16 years. His death came after the end of the Aquitanian War. He had fought against their duke, Waifar, for 9 long years. But in Paris the king died of the dropsy, leaving behind his own 2 sons, Charles, named after his own father, and young Charlemagne, named after Pippin's own brother. By the will of God, these 2 men were granted the Frankish throne. After his death, still mourning Pippin, the Franks called a solemn public assembly and elected the brothers as their kings, dividing the Frankish kingdom into 2 equal halves. Charles was given the lands Pippin had originally ruled, while Charlemagne the Younger was given the lands that had been possessed by his uncle Charlemagne before him. At the end of the assembly, the 2 kings accepted these conditions and received their shares of the kingdom. These 2 brothers also ruled side by side in near, but not perfect, harmony. Charlemagne had many supporters who constantly attempted to upset the peaceful alliance. Others urged Charlemagne toward open war. Not least among these was Charlemagne's wife and her sons. After his untimely death, she rejected all attempts by Charles to draw her near and instead fled the Frankish kingdom for Italy to take shelter in the court of Desiderius, king of the Lombards. It was disease that took Charlemagne after only 2 years of kingship, and after his passing, Charles was elected king of the entire realm. Regarding the days of his life before I knew Charles, of his childhood and youth, I cannot speak. I was not with him, and no writing remains of this time, nor are there any who survive from those earliest days. It would be foolish of me to speak of the unknown, so I will focus on what I do know. This book will be organized into 3 parts. First, his wars and exploits, both at home and abroad. Second, his personal habits and interests. And third, the administration of his kingdom and the end of his reign. I vow that I will only speak with impartial accuracy in this history, and that nothing shall be omitted if it demands or deserves inclusion. Part 1. The exploits of Charles at home and abroad. Charles waged war throughout his reign. His very first campaign was a return to Aquitania in the southwest. His father had begun this war, but Pippin had never finished it. To a young and unblooded Charles, of all the threats he faced, it seemed the most easily won. Charlemagne was still with him, and swore he would send men and aid for the campaign. Even though this necessary support never arrived, Charles still struck. At war, the king attacks so vigorously that he overwhelms opponents, and then he carries on past them, through them, never stopping, never slacking in his forward momentum until the enemy is entirely defeated. I have seen it again and again. In this instance, his target was Hunald, the father of Pippin's foe, Duke Waifar, who had died. On his son's death, Hunald had abandoned his monastic life and taken up the war to wrest Aquitania away from the Franks once and for all. But relentless Charles forced Hunald from Aquitania into Gascony instead. Then the king chased Hunald there as well, crossing in force at the Garonne. Sending his ambassadors ahead to the court of Lupus, Duke of the Gascons, Charles demanded the arrest of the fugitive. If Lupus would not consent, it would be immediate war. Wise Lupus chose not only to promptly hand over the fugitive Hunald, but also proclaimed that he submitted himself and the province of Gascony to the power of King Charles. After Aquitania was finally quelled and hostilities had ceased, Charles returned to a Frankish kingdom without a brother king at his side. As the sole ruler of the Franks, like his father before him, Charles turned his growing military might south, to the border with the Lombards. Charles had more than one reason to declare war against them. Hadrian in Rome, like his predecessor Pope Stephen, had long begged the Franks to intercede on their side against the Lombards, and Charles prepared for the conflict as Pippin had, moving great trains of men and material across the length of the kingdom to the foot of the Alps, over the objections of his own lords. But with Pippin all those years ago, before they invaded Lombardy, they told him they would not follow his orders any longer and demanded in open rebellion that unless he called off his Lombard campaign, they would abandon Pippin and return home. Yet Charles had stronger support, and the sheer energy of his warfare led to a different conclusion. His first target was the king Haistulf, whom his father had also fought. Back then, Pippin had finally prevailed upon his men to besiege Pavia for a few days, which brought the surrender of Haistulf and the promise that he would return the Roman lands he had seized. With solemn promises and hostages given as surety, Pippin withdrew, satisfied with the campaign. But not Charles. He did not stop with Haistulf, nor did he believe his assurances. After defeating him, he besieged the castle of King Desiderius himself, which eventually fell, forcing the duplicitous king to submit. Then Charles chased the son of Desiderius, Adalgis, not only from Lombardy but from all of Italy, thus dashing the hopes of those Lombards who had seen him as the new leader of their independence. Then Charles turned his wrath upon Hrodgausus, prefect of the Duchy of Friuli, who was attempting to take advantage of the chaos to begin his own rebellion. As he defeated and reformed each of these kingdoms, Charles forced them to give back the lands they had stolen from the Roman Church. Then Charles set his second son Pippin, named for his grandfather, as ruler over Lombardy and returned home. Here is where we recall the appalling difficulties of transiting the Alps, the endless toil of climbing those narrow mountain paths and crossing the pathless ridges, surrounded by towers of rock soaring to heaven with sharp-edged cliffs all about. Oh, I could write endlessly about the Alps, but that is not my purpose here. This is the chapter about the wars of King Charles. The result of this one was the conquest of Italy, the transportation and perpetual exile of King Desiderius, the permanent expulsion of his son Adalgis from Italy, and various rights and powers taken from the kings of the Lombards and restored to Hadrian, Prince of Rome. These had been major wars. Charles had already been fighting for many years. And yet they seemed as nothing compared to the next war, the greatest war Charles ever fought, the war against the Saxons of the German forest. Never was there a more protracted, bloody, or cruel conflict. Never were the Franks tested in the ways the Saxons tested them. For the Saxons, as with most of the German nations, are ferocious heathens who worship devils. They break the laws of God and men with careless delight. And there were countless flashpoints along our shared borders, which run the length of our eastern marches. And many of these remote regions are open plains, with long-standing grievances among the locals and disputed lines on the ground. Very few of the farms and settlements are constrained by natural boundaries, such as mountain ranges, rivers, and forests. In those days it was a lawless land, filled with murder, robbery, and arson on both sides of the borders. Finally, the Franks could take the harassment no more, and decided their isolated retaliations had not been enough. The Saxons must be subjugated by a campaign of total war. So, war was declared, and fought ceaselessly for over 30 years, both sides hacking at each other with an appalling ferocity that in the end cut more deeply into the ranks of the defending Saxons than the invading Franks. And yet they would not surrender. Not truly. The war would have ended sooner, far sooner, if the Saxons had ever, just once, kept their word. Countless times we had beaten them into submission, and extracted from them oaths of allegiance, and hostages, promises to obey the king's orders, and acceptance of the supervision of our ambassadors. The subjugation was brutal. The poor Saxons were so cowed and broken, they willingly abandoned their worship of devils and joined us in Christianity. But even among those, the moment our backs were turned, again would they break every oath and imperil every hostage. So eagerly did they defy us that it was impossible to take their cries of surrender and mercy seriously. Were they victim or traitor? Eventually we decided it was a combination of both. Not a year would go by in that 30-year war without a major betrayal from one Saxon lord or another. But Charles was unrelenting. Once he decided upon a course, his will was unstoppable. From his will sprung his undaunted courage, his intense focus, and the strength of his convictions which never wavered. Nothing shook him, neither defeats, nor betrayals, nor successes. He never took his eye from the eventual goal, the entire subjugation of the Saxon people. No winter storm nor bodily fatigue would ever stop him, and once he had fastened on a target such as this, he led his men toward it at once. For smaller conflicts of the Saxon war, he learned to send his counts, who harried the countryside and finally brought the entire country under his rule. And at last, once they were all defeated, he removed 10,000 inhabitants of the Elbe River Valley, whole communities from up and down both banks of the river, and forcibly relocated them to distant corners of Germany and Gaul. Finally, after 33 years, the Saxons were all made to abandon the worship of devils, to turn their backs on their traditions and ceremonies, to receive the sacraments of the Christian faith, and to join with the Franks in a larger union of one people and one kingdom. Despite fighting them for 3 decades, Charles only ever met the enemy in battle himself but twice, in an interval of just a few days. First in the district of Detmold, near the mountain called Osning, and then again at the river Hosna near Osnabrück. The king beat the enemy so harshly that they never attacked him directly again, at least without some advantage of ground which protected them from him, such as cliffs or broad rivers. Over the decades of fighting, many of the great men of both nations fell to each other, heroes of noble birth, worthy men of high office, and finally, after all those years of bloodshed, the Saxons submitted. Yet there was more war in the world than ever before, and even as conflict erupted on nearly every other border and among Charles's many interests abroad, he ruled so wisely and made such shrewd military and political decisions that all an observer could do was wonder if they should be more in awe of his Herculean work ethic or his unremitting good fortune. Think of this. The war in Italy began 2 years before the Saxon War, and yet, although both wars required maximum effort from a unified nation, neither conflict was ever given short shrift. Charles never shied away from committing his empire entirely to conflict, out of exhaustion or fear of destruction. Clear-eyed, he always spied the best way forward and could not be dissuaded by momentary adversities or the flatteries that came with his good fortune. During the heat of the Saxon War, he built border garrisons to keep them at bay so that he could turn his attentions to Spain. Gathering all the forces he could spare for another invasion, he crossed the Pyrenees and subdued the Spanish towns and fortresses on the far side, bringing their lands into his growing empire. It was an entirely successful campaign, apart from a single reverse his forces suffered on their return. Gascons, hiding in high mountain passes, watched as his long army train wound its way through their narrow defiles. Then, when all but the rear guard had passed, the traitorous Gascons rushed from their hiding places in the dense forests above and ambushed the baggage train and the men who guarded it. Thrown into disorder by the surprise attack, the Franks fought valiantly, but in vain. They were slain to the last man. Then these bandits stole the baggage and disappeared into the gathering night, scattering in every possible direction and allowing for no pursuit. Only because of their knowledge of the terrain and the fighting tactics they had adapted to it, including the lightness and flexibility of their armor and the way their trails vanished into nothing, were they able to escape unscathed. Many good men were lost in this tragic encounter. Eggihard, the surveyor of the royal table, Anselm, count of the palace, and Roland, prefect of the Breton March. All died with a great many others trying to protect the king's train. Even worse, there was no revenge to be had, for the Gascons had so perfectly vanished that not even a rumor remained as to their whereabouts. After returning home, Charles then turned his ferocity on the Bretons of the western shores. They had been defying him more and more, attempting to break away and rule themselves independently. But his expedition against them broke this rebellion and provided the king with promises of fealty and hostages to keep them loyal. Returning to Italy, Charles led the armies himself this time. Passing through Rome, he sought the lands of Beneventum, to tame these former vassals of the Lombards whose power he had broken, to add their kingdom to his own. At Capua, in Campania, he brought his forces, threatening a long siege unless their leaders declared him their lawful ruler. Aragis, the ruler of the Beneventans, appeased Charles and his demands in all ways but one. He promised fealty. He sent his sons Romuald and Grimoald to the Franks as captives. He swore to obey all the king's commands, but he refused to meet Charles face to face. The king could have punished Aragis severely for his obstinacy, but the wise king thought instead of the welfare of these Beneventans, who were now his subjects, more than the pride of their duke. He generously agreed to the duke's condition, and even sent the elder son back to him, keeping the younger hostage at his court. Once peace was restored, Charles returned to Rome to worship at their holy places before marching his great army north, back home. But not even wise Charles could anticipate all of the conflicts that would beset him. Bavaria rebelled suddenly, all due to the pride and folly of Tassilo, their duke. His wife, the Duchess, was the child of the exiled Lombard king Desiderius, and she sought vengeance for what had been done to her kin. She convinced her husband that his fortunes lay not with the Franks, but with the Huns, who held the lands to their east. Their might gave Tassilo a false courage, and he not only defied the Franks, but openly declared war against them. This was too much for proud Charles. In a rage, he led the armies himself to the river Lech at the borders of Bavaria with Germany. When Tassilo saw his certain destruction in the ranks upon ranks of invading Frankish soldiers, he abandoned his rebellion and threw himself on the king's mercy. He gave Charles all the hostages that were demanded, including his own son Theodo, and swore to never again stray from his allegiance. And just like that, what had looked to become a great and bloody war came to a swift and bloodless conclusion. Tassilo himself was removed from Bavaria to join the king at his palace, and Bavaria from that point forward was ruled not by an independent duke, but by counts of the Frankish court. That conflict settled, Charles turned his attentions to the far side of his Saxon lands, where the Slavs of the east caused trouble. The Franks called these Slavs the Vilci, but they called themselves the Veletabi. Their constant attacks against the Abodriti, the sometime allies of the Franks, earned them the wrath of Charles, and he led a campaign filled with the men of many allied nations against them, not least among them the Saxons, whose loyalty to Charles remained as changeable as the weather. This war was fought on the shores of the great northern sea, which extends from the western sea we know into the unexplored east, forming a gulf that is as wide as 100 miles across in some places, with certain narrow passages. Here dwell the Danes, and on the far shores the Swedes, whom we call the Northmen. They possess all the uncharted lands northward, as well as many of the islands in this ocean. On the eastern shores these Slavs and Aisti, and numerous other nations dwell, from which they might harass the eastern borders of our kingdom. In a single campaign, Charles broke their will to fight so completely that they swore allegiance and took oaths to obey his every command. Then Charles undertook his greatest conflict since the Saxon War, challenging the great power of the Huns and Avars to the southeast. Knowing this would be an immense trial, Charles spent years in preparation, building up and training his army for this specific conflict. Then, when it came time, he unleashed them with a fury that had never before been seen. Leading the army against the Avars in Pannonia, he leveled their cities and made of their fields a wasteland. Then he left the further prosecution of the war to his son Pippin and his counts and generals, who carried it forward with the same ferocity, inspired by their king. For 8 years they harried the Huns. Innumerable battles were fought across their lands. The destruction was so immense that even to this day, a traveler in Pannonia would wonder at the lifelessness of the landscape, and the district in which the Khagan ruled from his palace was so scoured of the Huns that not a single trace of their occupation, nor even of human life, remained. Scholars of today might wonder at how completely the Huns vanished from the historical record. It was Charles who wiped them completely away, taking not only their glory for his own, but also their vast amounts of treasure. Before this, in all the wars Charles fought, he found himself rich in land but poor in treasure. In fact, the Franks were then widely known for being an impoverished nation. But after they claimed the mountains of gold and jewels all the Huns and Avars had stolen, the Franks became known as among the wealthiest of all nations. But it did not come without some cost. 2 Frankish nobles died in this war. Eric, the Duke of Friuli, was caught in an ambush laid by the men of Tharsatica, a seaside town in Liburnia, and the governor of Bavaria, Gerald, was boldly assassinated along with his 2 aides as he was reviewing his troops, calling out to them by name and encouraging them to battle. The 3 assassins vanished somehow and were never identified. But these were the only great losses during this ferocious war. The Saxon War ended, and we became brethren. Our peace has lasted now as long as our strife did. Smaller wars engaged the empire's attention, one in Bohemia and another in Lüneburg. These were swiftly won under the guiding hand of the eldest son of King Charles, known as Charles the Younger. His final war was one that had been long in coming. The Northmen had first harried our coasts as pirates and then, liking what they found here, returned with great navies to take what was ours for themselves. Their king, Godofrid, had convinced himself that he was the rightful ruler of all Germany. He believed Frisia and Saxony were meant to be provinces in his Danish empire, so he sent his navies across the Great Sea to claim them. Charles swore to make him regret his rash actions. Fresh off his victory over his neighbors the Abodriti, Godofrid believed that no nation could withstand his fierce hordes. He declared to the world that his next destination would be the seat of the king's court in Aix, where he would arrive with a mighty host. There were even those in the halls of our own palace who fell to believing it. But whether he would have succeeded in his threat or not will never be known. Soon after declaring war against the Franks, one of Godofrid's own men, perhaps his own son, murdered him over a private matter. The Danish plans for conquest suddenly fell into chaos, and the crown passed to his ineffectual nephew. Peace was saved on our northern border for a generation. For 47 years Charles ruled, and he fought in nearly every one of them. He carried war to countries near and far to unite them into a single nation under a single glorious king who ruled with supreme skill and providence. His father Pippin had left him no small kingdom, but the empire Charles built was nearly double the size of the one he and his brother had inherited. In Pippin's time, the Frankish kingdom only claimed the regions of Gaul bounded by the Rhine, the Loire, and the Balearic Sea to the south, and those parts of Germany inhabited by the eastern Franks bordered by Saxony and the rivers Danube, Rhine, and Saale, the waterway which divides the Thuringians from the Sorabs, and he had the fealty of the Alemanni and Bavarians. But the ceaseless wars of Charles brought in the provinces of Aquitania and Gascony and the entirety of the Pyrenees, as well as the land of Spain as far as the banks of the Ebro, which courses from its origins in Navarre and feeds the most fertile regions of that land, before its waters pass beneath the walls of the city of Tortosa and fall into the Balearic Sea. Then he added the Italian peninsula from Augusta Praetoria in the Alps as far south as Lower Calabria. Here he faces the great empires of the Greeks and the Beneventans along a border 1,000 miles or more in length. Then he more than doubled the amount of Germany which the Franks held by his subjugation of Saxony, their region being twice as broad as that of the eastern Franks and just as long. Then further to the southeast he added the great Danube River valleys, with Pannonia and Dacia on one side, and Histria, Liburnia, and Dalmatia on the other. All of these kingdoms fell under the domain of King Charles, save a string of maritime cities he left to the Byzantine emperor as a sign of their amicable friendship and treaties. And finally, we count as our new territories the wide lands that house so many wild and barbarous nations to the east, between the great northern ocean and the rivers Rhine, Danube, and Vistula. These Slavs and their relations speak nearly all the same language, although their clothing, culture, and dispositions vary widely. Charles needed to fight the Veletabi to subdue them, as well as the Sorabi, the Abodriti, and the Bohemians. But most of these simple peoples surrendered without a fight. But as great as his conquests by military might, his heartfelt diplomacy was their equal. His friendships with his fellow kings were unprecedented. How can this charming familiarity not increase his legend and fame? Men truly loved Charles, such as Aldephonsus, king of Galicia and Asturica, who instructed his clerks in his letters and his ambassadors in the Frankish court to humbly describe him as the man of King Charles. The Scots loved his generous gifts so much that their kings addressed him as their lord and they his submissive servants. I still have access to the letters where they profess their undying love and fealty to him. With Harun al-Rashid, king of the Persians, who ruled over all the East save India, Charles found a lord whose legend nearly matched his own. They developed such an unbreakable friendship that the Caliph declared he valued the favor of the Frankish lord more than any man on earth, and showered him with titles and priceless gifts, insisting that Charles alone deserved them. He even did Charles the great honor of granting him a favor in the Holy Land, which Harun ruled. When our ambassadors appealed to the Caliph for access to the site of our Lord and Savior's resurrection and his holy sepulchre to present gifts which Charles had sent, Harun not only allowed the ambassadors access to these most holy sites, but he declared that they would become possessions of his friend, the Frankish king. The ambassadors returned not only with this good news, but also ambassadors of Harun, who showered Charles with even more gifts, silk robes and rare spices, and all the wonders of the Far East. He even went so far as to send Charles an elephant as a sign of his respect, which ended up only being the first of many. The emperors of Constantinople who ruled during the reign of Charles counted him as their closest friend. Nicephorus, then Michael, and Leo all welcomed him and made strong alliances with the king, and they exchanged ambassadors regularly. At first they naturally assumed he was their enemy, especially once he was granted the title of Holy Roman Emperor. They were certain that he must have designs on the Eastern Empire. But Charles approached them with humility and an open heart and convinced them of his sincerity. In the end, they all signed treaties which were never broken. Thus did Charles disprove the old Greek and Roman saying, "The Frank is a good friend, but bad neighbor." Part 2. The Personal Habits and Interests of Charles. But Charles did not only succeed at war. At home he was a great ruler as well. He gained as much glory from his development of the kingdom, including great works such as the grand wooden bridge of Aix, dedicated to Mary, the mother of our Savior. This bridge, crossing the Rhine near Mainz, spanned a distance of 500 feet and was one of the wonders of the realm. But the year before Charles died, the bridge burned down, and although it was one of his final wishes that the span be rebuilt with stone, his death precluded it from ever being rebuilt. But many of the grand palaces he had built still remain. One, in Ingelheim, also near Mainz, is particularly beautiful and stately, as well as another on an island of Nijmegen on the river Waal, which flows along the south of that Batavian island. And his abbeys and monasteries were also improved and restored. Special orders were given to all the bishops and priests of the Frankish kingdom to rebuild all that had fallen into disuse or ruin over the ages. Then Charles implemented an entire bureaucracy to make sure these pious wishes were followed. For his war against the Northmen, the king built a great fleet. Huge shipyards were established at the mouths of all the northern rivers that flow from Gaul and Germany into the sea. And to defend them from the Danish raids, Charles built forts and garrisons along with these shipyards in every harbor and river mouth to protect his coasts and prevent the raids. He undertook the same measures in the south, on the shore of Narbonne and Septimania in the southwest, and also along the entire Italian coastline as far south as Rome. Here he protected the peninsula from the raiding Moors, who had filled the seas with their pirates. And because these garrisons were so well placed, and their soldiers so well trained, Italy freed itself of these Moorish attacks, as Gaul and Germany found protection from the raiding Northmen. The single exception to this constant and abiding defense came through a betrayal. Centum Cellae, a city of Etruria, was delivered to the Moors and plundered. And, in truth, the relentless raiders of the north had some success among the Frisian islands lying closest to Germany. This is the record of the king's exploits over his long reign, and how he transformed the Frankish kingdom into the leading light of its age. Now I shall turn to Charles the man, his mind, his will, his resourcefulness, and I shall also provide a glimpse into the private life of the royal household. When Pippin his father died, and the kingdom was divided between Charles and Charlemagne, all was not peace and amity. Charlemagne had a quarrelsome and restless nature, which Charles bore with the utmost patience. Never once did he allow his brother to provoke him. The queen mother bade Charles to marry the daughter of Desiderius, the Lombard king, but after only a year he divorced her for unspoken reasons, although it is widely believed that her ill health prevented her from providing heirs to the throne. He married the young Hildegard, a Swabian of the most noble birth. She bore 3 sons, Charles, Pippin, and Ludovicus, and 3 daughters, Hrotrud, Bertha, and Gisla. He also had 3 other daughters, 2 by that woman Fastrada of the Eastern Franks, and 1 by a concubine whose name escapes my memory. When Fastrada died, he married the Alemannic Lutgard, but she never bore children. Upon her death he kept 4 concubines, Madelgarda, who bore him the daughter Rothild, the Saxon Gerswinda, who bore him the daughter Adolthrud, Regina, who bore Drogo and Hugo, and finally Adelinda, the mother of Theodoric. The mother of Charles, Bertrada, lived with him, well honored and loved, to an old age. He treated his mother with utmost reverence, and never spoke a cross word to her. The single exception to this came over the daughter of King Desiderius, whom he had only married at his mother's direction. He prevailed there, and they never disagreed again. Bertrada died at peace, knowing 3 strong grandsons and as many granddaughters would continue her line. The queen mother even outlived their mother Hildegard, who died after giving birth. Charles had his mother buried with great ceremony in the church of Saint-Denis, where his father lay. Charles only had 1 sister, Gisla, who had been secluded in a monastery since childhood. They rarely saw each other, but Charles treated her with the same love and respect he accorded their mother. She died only a few years before Charles did, after a life of long and quiet contemplation. One of his chief passions was the education of his children. Both sons and daughters were enrolled in a program of those liberal studies that so enthralled their father. Yet his sons were not meant to just be scholars. The moment they could sit in the saddle, they were taught to ride as true Franks, to wield weapons of war, and to hunt the countryside. His daughters were taught all the crafts of wool, and to fill their time with the spindle and distaff so they would avoid idleness and lethargy. To all of them, he appealed to their morals, and awoke in them the same high-minded character which he possessed. He lost 2 sons and a daughter before he died, most likely to a cow disease. His heir Charles died so young. We also lost Pippin, whom he made king of Italy, and his eldest daughter Hrotrud, who was long betrothed to Constantine, emperor of the Greeks, never lived to see her marriage. Pippin left 1 son, Bernard, and 5 daughters, Adelheid, Atula, Gundrada, Berthaid, and Theodorada. Charles loved them as his own children, bringing them up in the same way as the others, and appointing Bernard as his father's replacement in all ways. Of all men, Charles had the bravest and stoutest heart, except in the manner of the death of his children. Perhaps he bore these wounds with less patience than might have been expected of such a great leader, but the depth of his love for his family was as great as his stoic courage on the battlefield. And this tremendous love extended to his closest friends. Upon hearing of Hadrian's death in Rome at the incredible age of 95, he wept long and bitter tears over the loss of his very best friend, whom he loved as much as a brother or beloved father. The king set the finest example with his friendships. He made new ones easily and well, and maintained them faithfully. And once Charles had admitted a new friend into his circle, they were all treated with equal courtesy and respect. He loved nothing more than dining with his entire family whenever he was home, and never traveled without them. His sons rode beside him, with his daughters in the train at the rear of the column. Charles kept them well protected. A special retinue of guards would watch over them to secure their safety and honor. The princesses were very beautiful and desirable, yet as they came of age Charles did all he could to prevent any of them from leaving his side. He said he loved them too much to have them married off, even to one of his own kinsmen or a foreign ruler. But not even blessed Charles could avoid the scandals that came with a court full of unwed ladies. Yet he never acknowledged any of the dramas that swept through the palace. Such domestic intrigues and tragedies remained beneath his notice, and he never spoke in judgment against any of them, or withheld his love. Charles had yet one more son. This one, too, was named Pippin, born of a concubine. He is not listed with the others for a reason. As handsome as his brothers, his spine was twisted and his stature short. His ambition twisted him as well, for he hatched an impossible plot with a number of discontented Frankish lords to take control of the kingdom from his father. While Charles fought the Huns and wintered in Bavaria, this Pippin held back, feigning illness. But their designs were discovered before they could be put into effect, and the lords were punished for their actions. Pippin was tonsured and sent into seclusion, where he spent the remainder of his life. This was not the first conspiracy Charles had faced. Once, in Germany, a number of conspirators drew their weapons on him in court. Sworn to assassinate him, they slew other men of the court who tried to stop them. Then all mercy was abandoned and they were cut down. 3 of them were killed and the rest captured. They were maimed as punishment and blinded and transported into exile. Yet who would seek to kill such a good and glorious king? It has long been believed that these conspiracies were born in reaction not to the king himself, but to the cruelty of Queen Fastrada, who was never loved by his subjects. Only during their years together did Charles ever stray from his natural kindness and generosity. It was not until after she was gone that he resumed his open-hearted ways. Save this episode, his entire life he won the love and adulation of nearly everyone he met, and they were inevitably charmed by his care and mild temper. He loved the people of foreign lands, and invited great numbers of them into his kingdom. While they were often seen as a burden by many Franks, he saw them as a blessing to the nation, ignoring these criticisms and lifting his gaze above the mean complaints of selfish men. He knew that the legend he was creating of himself, of goodness and kindness and justice, was worth more than any treasure. Physically, Charles was a big, strong man. Taller than nearly all others, his height was 7 times the length of his foot. He was also of athletic build and moved well. His head was well formed and round, his eyes very large and piercing. He had a prominent nose and beautiful long white hair. He was always brisk and cheerful, and he had a natural commanding air that gave him, standing or sitting, the most impressive and dignified air. In his later years, the thickness of his neck and belly nearly ruined his pleasing form, but they never quite did. He retained a firm step and manly carriage learned on battlefields, yet his voice, although clear and decisive, was softer and higher than one would expect. Charles enjoyed good health throughout his life, until the fevers that plagued his last 4 years, and at the very end he lost the use of his foot. Yet he would not listen to the doctors, who begged him to stop eating roasted meats and to have them boiled instead. He kept his own counsel regarding his health until the end. He maintained his fitness with both riding and hunting, which is perhaps the national pastime of the Franks, which they pursue with a fervor not seen anywhere else. He swam constantly in open water and relaxed in hot mineral springs. No one he ever met could match his strength in the water. This is the main reason he built his palace at Aix, for the baths and swimming there were his favorite. Once the palace was complete, he happily lived and swam there until his final days. He invited everyone to the baths with him, not only his sons, but all his nobles and friends and visitors, often including his followers and bodyguards. He wore the classic Frankish national dress. His undershirt and drawers were linen, over which he wore a tunic with a silken fringe and hose on his legs, which were cross-gartered above his shoes. In winter he would warm himself with a heavy jerkin of otter and ermine skins and wrap himself in a heavy blue cloak. Charles always wore a sword, the hilt and belt gold or silver. This was always a functional weapon, unlike the jeweled ceremonial swords he would wield during festivals or events such as receiving new dignitaries. Despite his love of foreign people, he hated to dress as them, and I can only recall 2 occasions when he relented, first to Pope Hadrian and then to his successor, Pope Leo. They prevailed upon Charles to adopt the Roman fashion while he visited, in a long tunic and cloak with Roman shoes. The only other time he changed his costume was to don the royal garb. In ceremonies and on festival days, he would wear an entire garment of gold cloth, with jeweled boots and a golden girdle, a long cloak, and a diadem crown of gold and precious gems. Yet on all other days, his dress differed hardly at all from common people. His appetites were mild for both food and drink, but especially drink. He detested drunkenness in men, and disapproved of it both in himself and all his friends. Yet he could not abstain so easily from good food, and would maintain that any amount of fasting weakened him and degraded his health. Rarely did he host banquets, and only on the high festivals, but when he did, they were tremendous affairs with huge numbers of guests. Otherwise, he would eat a daily meal of 4 courses, before hunters would arrive carrying roasts still on the spit. These he ate with greater pleasure than any other food. As he ate, a singer or a reader provided him something to listen to, and entire histories of the great deeds of our ancestors were read aloud to him. Among his favorites were the books of St. Augustine, especially the books known as the City of God. So little drink passed his lips that during his entire meal he might have no more than 3 glasses of wine. In summer, after his midday meal, he would eat a small amount of fruit, then discard his boots and garments so that he may rest for the next 2 or 3 hours. At night, he slept so lightly that he would wake and rise 4 or 5 times. As he dressed in the morning, he would admit his many friends into his chamber, so they might discuss what was on his mind. There were many times that the count of the palace told the king that there was a dispute waiting on his judgment, and he had the litigants brought in to hear the case as if he was sitting at tribunal instead of at a dressing stand. He would conduct any of his business this way, with merchants and servants, with no regard for propriety or his own privacy. His speech was so fluent and eager, and one of his greatest gifts was his ability to express himself with utter clarity. He was a lifelong student of languages, learning a number of foreign tongues. Charles adopted Latin so well that he could speak it as well as his native tongue. His Greek was a little less impressive. He understood it better than he could speak it. He was so facile with words that he could speak nonstop for hours, nearly tiring the ears of his listeners. To Charles, the pillars of civilization were the liberal arts, and he devoted as much time and attention to them as he could. Those who had mastered these arts and those who taught them were gifted the highest honors he had. For lessons in grammar he learned from the great and wise Peter of Pisa. But for all other subjects his teacher was Albinus, known as Alcuin, a Saxon deacon from Britain who was the most learned man of our time. Charles practiced the arts of rhetoric and dialectic daily, and learned all he could from Alcuin of astronomy and its closely related skill of reckoning, by which he could chart the course of the stars. Near the end of his life, he tried to take up writing and calligraphy, which was until then a skill foreign to him. He even kept a set of tablets under the pillows of his couch so that he might practice in his spare moments. But Charles had difficulty mastering the pen to his satisfaction. Perhaps he had begun too late in life. He was the most devout, pious, and observant Christian, the faith which he had been raised in since infancy. Along with his splendid palace at Aix, he built an equally splendid church, decorated with gold and silver candelabras and with wicket gates and doors of solid brass. He wanted Frankish marble for the columns, but, finding none, transported huge amounts from Rome and Ravenna. Until his health forbid it, he diligently attended Mass in both the morning and the evening, and also at night, and at the time of the sacrifice. Charles insisted on the most perfect expression of the rites, and took great care that all the services of the Church were performed with dignity. He was fastidious in his orders that nothing improper or unclean would ever pass the threshold of his church. He filled it with gold and silver vessels. He dressed not only the priests in special fine vestments, but the deacons and altar boys, and even the lowest ecclesiastical order of the doorkeepers, who nearly always wear their own clothes in other churches. He labored long and carefully to reform the liturgy to the standard he himself was instructed in. But he never spoke in church himself, and only sang in a low voice, blending it in with the rest of the congregation. The charity of his faith was one of his favorite aspects of service. He was devout in relieving the poor with liberal gifts of coin and those small gifts which the Greeks call alms. And he wasn't only concerned about the poor and suffering in his own kingdom. He would send treasure and gifts across the sea to Syria and Egypt, and further into Africa. He supported the poor in Jerusalem, Alexandria, Carthage. Wherever he heard there were suffering Christian souls, he always lent a hand. This is how he initiated all his friendships with foreign kings, persuading them to care for the followers of Christ in their realms. No church or cathedral meant more to him than the church of the holy apostle Peter in Rome. Charles poured into its treasury endless gifts of silver and gold and precious stones. He gave even more gifts directly to the papacy, proving to them over the course of his reign that his oath to restore Rome to its ancient majesty and might truly was the great project of his life. Enriching St. Peter's was his way of doing this, raising it high above all other churches. Yet as much as he adored Rome and spoke of its primacy in nearly all things, he was a Frank at heart, and only succeeded in visiting 4 times during his entire life to make his vows and offer his prayers. His final visit to Rome was not for solemn worship, however, but revenge. The Romans had overthrown Pope Leo. They had torn out his eyes and cut off his tongue and exiled him. He threw himself on the mercy of King Charles. Our sovereign was immensely disturbed by this crime, and he traveled to Rome to reform the church, which was a mess of politics, and he spent the entire winter there to finish the job. In the end, the Romans granted him the title of emperor, and he became Charles the Great, Carolus Imperator Augustus, Charlemagne. But he did not accept the title willingly. They bestowed it upon him during his attendance at a high festival. He said afterwards that if he had known the Pope meant to grant the title to him that day, he would have not gone into that church. He accepted the titles, which gave name to the power he already possessed, and suffered quietly the enmity from all those who were outraged at this declaration. Charles bore their hostility patiently, and then, after the Byzantines in particular had cooled, he assuaged their fears with lavish gifts and oaths of eternal brotherhood and constant contact from his many embassies to their lands. Part 3. The administration of Charles's kingdom and the end of his reign. Once he returned home, he set to put right the legal system of his own empire, which had long been defective. Two independent and, in some cases, contradictory legal systems existed at the same time, which caused immense problems. Charles approached this issue as one of his great works, studying criminal codes and developing legal theories, and proposing an entire new architecture for the judiciary. In the end, he ran out of time, and none of it was ever enacted, save a few minor capitularies, which were entered unfinished into the record. But one thing which he did order that has had a profound effect on the empire is that he commanded all its laws to be written down and collected. Charles also loved the ancient songs of the Frankish people that described the legacies of his barbarous kingly ancestors and told of their great deeds. He wrote these down for posterity and committed a great deal of them to memory. He then formulated an official grammar of his native tongue to keep it whole and alive. Elevating the Frankish language became a passion of his. He gave each of the 12 months their own names, instead of the mix of Latin and barbarous labels they bore. He also codified the 12 winds and gave them each names, instead of the 4 winds which had been known. He called January winter month, February mud month, March spring month, April Easter month, May joy month, June plow month, July hay month, August harvest month, September wind month, October vintage month, November autumn month, and December holy month. In his final days, bowed down by disease and death, he summoned his son Louis, king of Aquitania, sole surviving son of his first wife Hildegard. In a solemn assembly attended by every chief and leader of the entire Frankish kingdom, Charles asked for their assent in naming Louis as his heir in all things. They consented unanimously. Charles removed the emperor's crown from his own head and placed it on the head of his son, declaring that he now would be saluted as emperor and Augustus. The hall rang with their shouts of love and support. To all present, it seemed as if the king's grace continued to extend and would still provide for his empire when the man was no longer with them. They spoke of this day of peaceful transfer as a holy event, inspiring awe in those who were not there, even the rulers of far-off lands. After Louis had returned to Aquitania, the elderly Charles prevailed over his weak and frail body to ride in a long hunting expedition in the forests near Aix. He spent the remainder of the autumn doing what he loved and returned to the palace in November as the seasons turned. In the depth of winter, in January, he was struck by sharp fevers. Ever his own doctor, he prescribed himself a smaller diet, which was his regular treatment for fevers. He had been able to control his fevers in the past with all the arts and skills the wise old king had learned. But in this case, the infection gained hold in the pleurisy of his chest and would not relent. So he starved himself more extremely, only taking fluids, then only water. And after 7 days of this, when he had wasted away to nearly nothing, he accepted the Holy Communion and passed at 9 o'clock on the 28th of January, in his 73rd year and the 47th of his glorious reign. His body was reverently washed and tended, but there was doubt and confusion about where his final rest should be. Charles had left no orders about it. Hastily decided, by the end of the day, a procession led him into the great church of Aix that the pious king had founded, where he was buried. The grief of his people was immense and long-lasting. They placed a gilded monument atop his tomb with a plaque that declared, "Under this tomb is placed the body of Karl, the great and orthodox emperor, who gloriously enlarged the realm of the Franks and successfully reigned over 47 years. He died in the 73rd year of his age, January 28th, Anno Domini 814, Indicion 7. His death was in no way a surprise. The signs of its approach were numerous and clear. Even Charles himself noticed and remarked upon them, as did many others. For example, over the 3 years before his death, there were frequent eclipses of both the sun and moon, and black spots could be seen on the sun's face over 7 consecutive days. The portico between the church and the palace, which had recently been built with tremendous skill and labor, collapsed all the way down to its foundations on the day of the Ascension of our Lord, and the great wooden bridge of the Virgin Mary over the Rhine, which was the single greatest building achievement of his reign and was built with care over 10 years to last 1,000, burned down in an accident in only 3 hours. The destruction was so complete that there wasn't enough wood left above the water line to fashion a lance shaft. But these were not the only portents. Years before, on an expedition against Walafrid in Saxony, Charles was a horse before dawn to prepare for the day's march. Suddenly, a brilliant light blazed across the clear sky from the right horizon to the left. All cried aloud, and the horse on which the king rode swooned, throwing him. He landed on his head, hitting the ground so soundly that his cloak's clasp burst and his sword belt snapped. The javelin he carried fell over 20 feet away. Racing to him, his attendants removed his gear and carried him gently to safety, where he slowly recovered. And then there were the constant tremors beneath the palace at Aix. It seemed everywhere Charles dwelt, the walls and ceilings would crack, as if the earth itself responded to him, and buildings could not contain him. The church where he was buried was soon struck by lightning, and the golden apple which adorned the top of its steeple was knocked from its perch into the adjoining house of a priest. And finally, in that same church, along the interior walls on the cornice between the upper and lower arches, a long inscription had been painted there in red letters. It ended with the words Carolus Princeps. Many people noticed that in the year of his death, in the months of his decline, the word princeps faded so that it hardly could be seen at all. But Charles hated these omens and refused to believe that they were any kind of message from on high related to himself. It was his worry about his many daughters and illegitimate children that prompted him to draw up a will, so that he may make some provision for them. But contemplating a world without himself in it was never a favorite subject of his, so he delayed and delayed its writing. In the end, he never finished it at all. But he had made a declaration 3 years before, which had been witnessed by his friends and attendants, and this was the contract they followed. It read, "In the name of the omnipotent Lord God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, description and division made by the most illustrious and pious Prince Karl, Emperor Augustus, in the year of the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ, 811, in the year of his reign of Francia, 43, in Italy, 37, and of the imperial dignity, 11, and indician, 4, guided by holy intention and thought, determined this distribution of his valuables as are found in his treasury on this day." Charles hoped to set aside a healthy portion of his riches and possessions as the customary alms that are distributed at the death of every good Christian. And he also aimed to avoid any of the confusion and contention that came about among heirs with their inheritances. By clearly listing each of his goods and chattels, he labored to remove all doubt as to who owned what. That goal being defined, he then tabulated the entire contents of his treasury and divided it into 3 equal portions. 2 of these portions were again divided into 21 parts, and the remaining third he preserved intact. 21 was the number of great metropolitan cities of the realm. He dispatched his friends and heirs to each of the archbishops of these cities with these gifts of alms. Of these parts, they were then instructed to keep 1/3 of the wealth for the church, and to spend the remaining 2/3 on the suffering and needy. These obligations covered the 21 parts of the first and second threefold portion, and once they were decided, the funds were counted and separated into a depository with the name of each city labeling each portion. The cities who received these alms were Rome, Ravenna, Milan, Friuli, Graz, Köln, Mainz, Salzburg, Trier, Sens, Besançon, Lyon, Rouen, Reims, Arles, Vienne, Moutier in the Tarentaise, Embrun, Bordeaux, Tours, and Bourges. The intact third he set aside for the daily running of the empire and its continuing needs, for there were still many obligations which required continuous funding. Upon his death, the last accounting of his treasury was divided into 4ths. The first 4th was distributed as alms across the empire, along with the 21 parts to the great cities. The second was apportioned between his sons and daughters and their children in just and fair proportions. The next 4th was specifically set aside for the poor, and the 4th was a gift of alms as well, to be distributed among all the men-servants and maidservants of the households of his palaces. These payments were all made in the gold and silver coin of his realm. But in this last dispensation of 4 quarters, he added all the precious vessels and utensils of the households, together with all the arms and decorative clothing and precious tapestries, hangings, coverlets, haircloths, leatherworks, cushions, and whatever else may be found in all his chests and closets on his final day. He wanted all to share as much of his wealth as could be liberated to them. He directed that only his private chapel should remain undisturbed, with all the items and valuables that both he and his father had collected. He ordered that these things would remain in proper use and never be divided from each other. All other items that had been collected in the chapel were given away or sold, and the proceeds were added to the charity he dispensed. He also opened his great libraries to any who might wish to purchase his books, so that the money from those sales would also go to alleviate the suffering of the poor. Among his countless treasures were 3 priceless tables of solid silver and 1 of solid gold, all of massive size and weight. He sent the first, a giant square silver table, with the city plan of Constantinople etched into its surface, to Peter the Apostle's church in Rome. The second, which was round and bore the city plan of Rome, he sent to the Episcopal Church of Ravenna, and the third and greatest silver table, which contained etchings that mapped the entirety of the world along with the gold table, he gave to his heirs. This declaration and settlement was made before these bishops, abbots, and counts who attended him that day. Bishops: Hildebald of Köln, Ricolf of Mainz, Arno of Salzburg, Wolfar of Reims, Bernouin of Besançon, Leidrad of Lyon, John of Arles, Theodulf of Orléans, Jesse of Amiens, Hato of Basel, and Waltgaud of Lüttich. Abbots: Frederick of Saint-Martin at Saint-Omer, Adelung of Saint-Vedas at Arras, Engelbert of Saint-Riquier at Abbeville, and Irmin of Saint-Germain in Paris. Counts: Wallaco, Megenher, Otulf, Stephen, Unroch, Burkhard, Megenhard, Hatto, Riwin, Edo, Erkangar, Gerald, Bero, Hildegard, and Rockholf. The son of Charles, Louis, who by divine will succeeded him, examined and approved of this summary and dispensation, and dutifully carried out his father's wishes upon the death of the king.